Well, we're excited to talk about some other folks that you've crossed paths with because, according to the rumor and innuendo, tonight is going to be a big night in their career as we sit here and click record. We're talking about the team we've known as the Motor City Machine Guns, Alex Shelley and Chris Sabin. I think when most people think of these guys, they think of the success they had in TNA. I must admit, I was first aware of Alex Shelley from his work in Ring of Honor, but I think you really put them together, and the push they received as Motor City Machine Guns. I mean, a lot of people, used to think that they were one of, if not perhaps the best tag team in the game at the time. And they were in TNA basically from the beginning, both trained by Scott Demore, who, shout out to Scott, we're like a month away from his debut of Border City Wrestling. Or no, not Border City Wrestling, Maple Leaf Wrestling.
Yes.
That's the name of it, Maple Leaf Wrestling. He's got the old Jack Tunney footage, which is super cool and has the trademark. And he's got a big show planned. And I'm sure in an alternate universe, these guys would have been a big part of that program. But the rumor and innuendo is that we're going to see him tonight on NXT, Jeff.
That's good. When you told me before we hit tape, I've been excited to talk about this topic because not just if you were a fan, if you're a fan of wrestling, to hear these guys' stories, and we're going to get into it, but just kind of a correction right off the top. Yes, I was responsible for bringing them in TNA, but they actually formed as a team for the first time, I guess officially, was in Japan. But they had instant chemistry, and that kind of morphed into. But man, Alex Shelley and Chris Sabin were two guys that were, I'll call them X Division super standouts. And so this topic is going to be fun to talk about, to kind of hear how they started, how they kind of got together, and then the success. And really, when you look about the history of, I'll call it the TNA years, and I know we're into some new TNA years, and I'm saying that before Impact, it became Impact Wrestling, how integral they were to really the X division and then to the tag division. It's those guys, super talented, man, super talented.
I can't wait for us to see what they're going to do in NXT if the rumor and innuendo is true. But I wanted to ask you about the guys sort of individually. Like, I remember Alex Shelley getting a reputation very early in his career. I mean, maybe like in the first year of, hey, man, this guy's really good and really smooth for having only a handful of matches. What was your first impression of Alex Shelley when you saw his work?
So, with so many guys and the early days of TNA, it's funny. I read the research on this maybe a month ago, Conrad, because we've been shucking and jiving in different topics. So, but it kind of brought me back to just not just these guys, but so many different guys. And I can tell you, whether it was Jeremy Borash or Bob Ryder or AJ Styles or Chris Daniels. I'm just trying to think of guys that were, I'll say, talent, office. So many guys would get pitched to me. And, we've had the conversations about me and my father about, he's like, man, I feel like you're getting too many guys in here. And I said, well, there's going to be a lot of turnover in the X division. But I said, early days before we had the ladies division, the knockouts, it was heavyweights, tags, and X division. And there were so many guys that turned over that we would bring in, and especially in the Asylum days and all that. But there was a little bit of a buzz, I'll call it indie buzz, on different guys that would ebb and flow. But both of those guys, and Alex was kind of had a, how do I say this? I don't want to say buzz too much, because that I think kind of downplays it. I'll say the recommendations from him, not only Scott Demore, but other talent, they're like, yeah, this guy's pretty damn good. He's really crisp, would be maybe a word, or he's can do the chain wrestling. He can kind of chain and mat wrestling, and he can just do this style. You ought to take a look at him. Those are the type words that I heard. And when you hear it from enough folks, because I'll say this, when you hear different pitches from different guys, and I heard so many in those early days, I always, and this is the thing that can kind of get you, I don't know, Conrad, cynical. Is like, okay, what's behind it? Why does this guy want this guy in, and this and that, and what's the motivation? But Alex and Chris were both guys that just came highly recommended for their in-ring work. Nothing more, nothing less.
Let's talk a little bit about Chris Sabin. I know that Sabin is going to enjoy singles success. He's even going to become TNA world champion. When you think of Chris Sabin, I mean, do you think of him as, you know, I don't mean for this to sound the way it does, but sometimes in a different generation, when you had guys who didn't look like the Road Warriors and they worked a faster pace, you would hear them called tag team specialists. I think of like the Rock and Roll Express when I say that. When you think of Chris Sabin, do you think of him as a single star or as a tag team specialist?
Without question, I think both of those guys. And again, this is from my brain and my perception, and I think everybody has kind of different thoughts and all that. But always, now look, we're looking at the 2000s, and yes, Nitro had a heavy influx. I'll call it of the cruiserweights, but I think the cruiserweights had so much lucha influence. I think the lucha / cruiserweights were almost one and the same. When I looked at the X division and the guys that I kind of wanted to implement, and obviously AJ from day one was a guy that, look, there's going to time, and there was a, early that he moved out of the X division and went into the heavyweight. But the X division guys, and I look at Chris and Alex, and yes, they came together as a team. They're still together as a team and a great team, but individually, they were really, really good. Great. I'll call them X division specialists. And I think the X division wrestler put together that hybrid style, because some guys, I mean, Samoa Joe, I think, was a great X division wrestler because he could do the grounded pound from Japan, but he could also be a great base and do, he might not be doing the high flying, but he could adapt and be the base and everything that went with it. Certain guys, Chris Daniels, another guy, an X division specialist. I think Alex and Chris were two of those guys that could do a little bit of hard hitting, maybe ground game from Japan, a little bit of lucha, a little bit of European mat wrestling, but also Chris and Alex know how to showboat, no doubt. And I think their chemistry, when they became a team, that went to another level because they were identified, and I hate to say this, but had a gimmick. But the Motor City Machine Guns, Detroit, and all that, you felt the vibe and an aura about them, as opposed to just two individuals.